It's everywhere. It's just coming from all over the place. I said to the previous service that it makes me uncomfortable when people clap or whoop or anything like that before anything has happened, because exactly like that. Because then what if it goes bad? And you're like, I whooped for some, I pre-whooped and I shouldn't have. I really should like reserve my whoops until I know for sure that it's going to go the way it should. Because if it's a catastrophe and you whooped beforehand, you can't take it back. So I'm going to try and honor your whoops, and hopefully it'll go well for the next half hour or so. Anyway, that wasn't part of the sermon. So my name is Rob, like Matt said. Thank you guys so much for being here. We're continuing the series that we've been in for a little while called We Make the Road by Walking, and we've been journeying through the book of Acts. And if you've been with us, then you've sort of gotten a glimpse of, okay, so what Acts is this document of a post-resurrection reality in which this group of people are trying to figure out what does it look like to follow the way of Jesus, because nobody's ever done that before. And so how do we as a community, how do we exist? How do we make good choices? How do we treat each other in the midst of this thing that we're just kind of figuring out to begin with, hence the title, We Make the Road by Walking. So we spent a lot of time this year, actually, not even just in the series, but like back in July, I did a whole series on the life of Peter. And one of the things, and so Peter shows up a lot. And so in fact, today we're going to be looking at the final story where Peter appears in a narrative fashion. And so one of the things that we've talked about in examining the life of Peter is sort of like how he began and kind of where he went on his journey, kind of the overall character arc of that. And so Peter is one of Jesus' original disciples. And what we talked about already is that in these stories about Peter, it's not just, like, Peter is a representative of himself, but he's also a representative of a larger group of people, like the original disciples. He becomes kind of a stand-in for everybody at this time who is in this particular part of, like, this cultural movement and trying to figure out what does it look like for us to be a part of this. So Peter becomes sort of a representative of a larger group of people than just himself. And Paul, other than Jesus and Paul, Peter is mentioned more times in the New Testament than any other person. So it can be a really instructive thing to really dig in and kind of look at where Peter begins and where he goes. And what that's referred to in storytelling, this is referred to as a character arc. And so basically what we're talking about when we talk about character arc is when the story begins and a person is a certain way or sees the world in a certain fashion, and then by the end of the story, if something has changed, that's referred to as a character arc. So a classic example of a character arc is like Ebenezer Scrooge, right? So you've got this guy, he hates Christmas, he's very like greedy and kind of like stuck in his own world. He's very annoyed by all the Muppets that continue to sing songs around him. I assume that's the only version of that story that exists. I've not really looked into it that much. So, no, nothing? Okay, so anyway, there are other stories. So that didn't go great. So anyway, what you have with Scrooge is you have the beginning of the story, someone who is very closed off, someone who is very centered on himself and not open-hearted to other people. And by the end of the story, he's generous, he's more open-hearted, he is warm towards other people. That is called a character arc. And so the question becomes, when you look at a character arc, what you're kind of beginning to see is, oh, this is what the story has been about the whole time. It's about, the story of Ebenezer Scrooge, A Christmas Carol, is a story about becoming more and more open to other people. That is the arc leads you to the conclusion of, oh, this is what the story has been the whole time. So if you're going to look at the entire story arc of Peter, where does Peter begin and where does he end, and what does that tell you about what the narrators are trying to explain about, oh, the whole thing has been moving in this particular direction. So Acts chapter 15 is the final appearance of Peter in narrative form. We have a couple of letters that are attributed to Peter's authorship, but this is the last time we see Peter in a storytelling form. So the question becomes, if we look at Acts chapter 15, what do we learn about Peter and how has Peter changed since the beginning of the story? So early on, and we don't have time to go back into all of this, but early on, going back into the earliest stories about Peter, what you see is you have somebody who kind of is defined by a couple of things. So first of all, you could argue that Peter begins the whole thing. If you go back into Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the original appearances of Peter, one is that Peter is disempowered. And what I mean by that is Peter is a citizen of a population that has been conquered and overtaken by the Roman Empire. So Peter is a Jewish guy living in the Judean territory. He's probably a Jewish teenager or like late Jewish teenager, possibly. at his first introduction, which means Peter has grown up in a world in which disempowerment is just kind of part of the atmosphere. Is that you have been disempowered because Rome has come in and said, we are in control now. We are overseeing things in the way that we want to. You're going to pay taxes to us. You will worship in whatever ways we allow you to worship your own gods, and you will pay fealty to Caesar and to Herod in whatever way that we dictate. And so Peter comes from a disempowered position. And so there's a massive system that has been disempowering Peter's entire people group. So that's the first thing. The second thing that we see is that Peter tends to have an enclosed view of what God is doing in the world. And what I mean by that is Peter tends to see the whole world in very black and white binary terms. This person is with us, this person is against us. This person is good, this person is bad, this person is right, this person is wrong. You with me? So the whole thing that we see with Peter is disempowered and has an enclosed view of reality. So the original assumptions that Peter was raised amongst was that at some point, a Messiah will come and will liberate us from the Roman Empire. And everyone who is with us, everyone who is good, will stay, and everyone who is bad will be gone, will be violently and physically forced out or killed in whatever way suits us. So that is Peter's original point of view. That's where we find Peter at the beginning of his narrative. So one of the dominant questions of the day, not just with Peter, but with everybody, one of the dominant questions of the day, if you go into Acts chapter 15, now in a post-resurrection reality, where we've spent some time with Peter already, one of the dominant questions of the day is, okay, who's in? And who is out? What qualifies someone to be in, and what causes someone to be forced out? How do you decide who belongs and who doesn't? This is a dominant question in the early church. So at its origins, the whole movement, this whole Jesus movement, was was entirely populated by people who were Jewish. It has its roots in the Judean territory, specifically in Jerusalem, which means most of the people who were original adherents to this movement were Jewish. So the assumption was this thing arose out of Judaism, out of first century Judaism, and everybody in this movement already is Jewish. Therefore, if it begins to expand, everybody who joins the movement will also in some way become Jewish. That was the assumption, because that's how it started. Because the whole thing didn't start as like its own kind of unique and specific isolated thing. It began as a subset of a whole other thing, of the Jewish people, of the Jewish faith. And so, I'm so sorry. I'm having a hard time with my voice today. So anyway, at its origins, the whole movement was entirely populated by people who were Jewish, people who observed specific Jewish customs, practiced specific Jewish rituals and practices. So you have this embedded assumption that the whole thing will remain at some level Jewish. So as the movement expands, it has begun reaching more and more people outside of the Jewish tradition. And so the question becomes, should new members be expected to become Jewish? So in fact, the entire book of Galatians is an answer to this question. It's basically this writer, Paul, saying no. Like there are certain requirements that we're putting on people and that we should not be requiring of them. And so now we're in the final story about Peter in the book of Acts, and the context is the same controversy continues to pop up, which is, do you have to, I'm trying not to use certain words because I realize there are kids in the room and you don't have to like stop and explain what certain things mean. But the same controversy keeps popping up, which is like, exactly how Jewish are we going to expect everybody to become? And so in one specific way. So in Acts chapter 15, verse 1, it says, certain people came down from Judea to Antioch. So Judea, by the way, is a fully Jewish populated area. Antioch is not. And so certain people came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the believers, unless you are circumcised, which is a specifically Jewish practice, unless you are circumcised, and I won't explain it, feel free to ask your parents later, according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. So the teaching here is you have to become Jewish in this very specific way, and as a result, then you will be a part of this movement. So now, why this is interesting is because, again, Antioch is not a Jewish city. It sits at the southern tip of what we would now know as modern-day Turkey. And so they are no longer having these big meetings just in Jerusalem. These conversations aren't just happening in Jewish circles. They've expanded. And so now we're in Antioch, which is not a Jewish place. And we're beginning to have these kinds of conversations as well. The whole thing is getting bigger. And so now they're having these conversations in Antioch. And the question becomes, does everyone here, which presumably most of the people in Antioch, not already there. if you're with me. So the question is, does this entire room full of people have to go through this particular ritual, or can we go ahead and just assume that maybe that's not the most important thing? And so then in verse 2, it says, this brought Paul and Barnabas into sharp dispute and debate with them, which again, if you've read Galatians, you know, like Paul has a pretty firm position on this. Paul is very much anti-forcing people to do anything to qualify them as in or out. And so Paul and Barnabas were appointed, along with some other believers, to go up to Jerusalem to see the apostles and elders about this question. So now we're like, okay, we got to bring everybody, all the leadership into this to really settle this question once and for all. So we go back to Jerusalem to form what is now referred to as the Jerusalem Council. And so in verse 3, it says, the church sent them on their way, and as they traveled through Phoenicia and Samaria, they told how the Gentiles, and Gentile is a way of referring to someone who is not Jewish, how the Gentiles had been converted. This news made all the believers very glad. When they came to Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the church and the apostles and elders, to whom they reported everything God had done through them. So then in verse 5, it says, then some believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees stood up and said, the Gentiles, the non-Jewish people in our midst, must be circumcised and required to keep the law of Moses. Now, this is kind of interesting because we always sort of talk about Pharisees. If you grew up in any sort of like evangelical church environment, you know that Pharisees are usually kind of like painted as like just the villains of the story. And so the idea, first of all, that there are Pharisees who are now part of the Jesus movement is kind of remarkable. That kind of goes without much commentary, but you have this group of people. And Pharisees, it's this interesting sort of thing. Like, again, we kind of tend to paint them with a pretty broad brush. But what you could kind of talk about them in sort of terms of members of a political party almost, if you were trying to sort of create comparisons to what we know today. But Pharisees were a group of people who firmly believed, they had a very true, sincere belief that the best way to get rid of Rome was to be as adherent and faithful to the law as you possibly could. And so not only would this bring you closer to God, but if the more of us who are participating in the law in the way that we were always told to, the more faithful we are to that calling, then, thank you so much, Travis. So the more faithful you are to that calling, the more likely it is that we will get rid of Rome and have our nation back. So the Pharisees believe, like anybody who's not following the law in the way they were supposed to, you're actually kind of holding us back from becoming who we were meant to be. This was a firmly, like, sincere belief that they held, and they came to it very honestly. So they generally believed that this was just the best way to be. So there are Pharisees who have joined the Jesus movement now, which is already kind of amazing and impressive, but they've also brought some of this old baggage with them. And now we're having to deal with, okay, so what do we, like, how do we reconcile this? How do we or do we not require people who are joining this to become more like us, to become Jewish in every possible way? And so this was the biggest controversy in the first century church. And so in Acts 15, verse 6, it says, the apostles and elders met to consider this question. After much discussion, Peter, so now we have Peter showing up. Peter got up and addressed them. And you would expect Peter, having known Peter early on in the stories, you would expect Peter to come down on the opposite side of Paul and Barnabas. You would expect Peter to say, like, no, these are our practices. If you want to be in, you have to show us that you mean it. You would expect that from Peter. And so, but it says Peter got up and addressed them. Brothers, you know that some time ago God made a choice among you that the Gentiles might hear from my lips the message of the gospel and believe. God, who knows the heart, showed that he accepted them by giving the Holy Spirit to them, just as he did to us. He did not discriminate between us and them, for he purified their hearts by faith. Can you imagine the earlier version of Peter saying something like this? God did not discriminate between us and them. This reflects a massive shift in Peter's paradigm. This is not the same person that you encounter at the beginning of the gospel stories. Then in verse 10, it says, now then, this is still Peter speaking. It says, now then, why do you try to test God by putting on the necks of Gentiles a yoke that neither we nor our ancestors have been able to bear? No, we believe it is through grace, the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, or our Lord Jesus, that we are saved, just as they are. Peter says something pretty profound here, pretty shocking. He says, if following the law was so great, wouldn't we be better at it by now? Is basically what he says. Our ancestors never got this right. We have never figured out how to do this exactly the way that has always been sort of handed to us that we were expected to. Why would we start like going around to other cultures and imposing this baggage on them when we can't even figure out what exactly we're doing? So it says, why do you think our ancestors struggled with this so much, is what Peter's basically saying. So Peter seems to be saying, maybe the law is actually there to show us what a profound gift grace really is. Maybe the reason we have the law to begin with is to highlight and spotlight like how powerful grace actually can be. So this is the final word from Peter. This guy who was brash and impulsive and rude and violent and completely set in his ways has now reached the end of his narrative, and he's open, and he's humble, and he's gracious towards people who are different than him. This is not the same guy that we met earlier in the story. What has happened? How has Peter's arc led him to this moment? After all of his experiences, Peter seems to be saying, we are not the bouncers at the door with a clipboard and a velvet rope. It is not our job to police someone else's faith. It is our job to be hospitable and kind and to make space for everybody. How has Peter gotten there? We start with a guy who probably came out of a system where it was completely culturally acceptable to wish your enemies dead and to hope that some sort of violent removal of everyone who wasn't like you would occur. And now he's giving a speech in Jerusalem and saying the whole thing's about grace and openness. He's saying, we're talking about a God who has never discriminated between us and them. He's in Jerusalem talking about this. Like, that's crazy. There's your character arc. Peter has completely changed his mind about how he views people who aren't like him. So I want to make a couple of observations, first of all, about the speech that he's making, but also about the overall character arc that we've seen from Peter. First of all, Peter's life is largely defined by how he wrestles with his own faith. And again, we talked about this a lot back in July. We talked about the scene where Peter denies Jesus. And we talked about how this is a moment where Peter has to actually like ask himself, do I even believe in the thing that I've signed up for? This is a real moment for him. So Peter's life is largely defined by how he wrestles and how he asks questions and how he has had his own beliefs challenged in certain kinds of ways. Look at what Paul says in Philippians chapter 2, verse 12. He says, therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. So if you grew up like a lot of us did, probably, the concept of working out your own salvation is not something that probably got talked about a lot. It was either like you are or you're not, right? You either have recited this particular prayer, you have gone through a specific exercise, and now you have received this thing, and anybody who hasn't done those practices has not. There is no like working anything out. You either have it or you don't, right? Like I would imagine most of us came out of a similar kind of way of talking about this. But Paul doesn't talk about it in those terms. He talks about it in terms of you need to work this out. What does he mean? How do you work something out like this? I would argue what he's saying there is keep asking questions. Keep challenging your old assumptions. Peter starts following Jesus, and there are moments where Jesus has to call him out for having completely wrong assumptions. In fact, one time Jesus even calls Peter Satan because he is so misguided in terms of what he assumes is supposed to be happening here. Peter cuts off a guy's ear. Peter has these moments of kind of not getting it. And there are these, and in confrontation of these moments, you have Jesus saying, let's rethink this. Let's have a different way of viewing it. This is after Peter already agrees to be a part of this movement. What's he doing? He's working something out. He's continually having things challenged and pushed back on. He's continually kind of ebbing and flowing, kind of almost pushing and pulling against the thing that he has just always taken for granted. And so what if the whole time Jesus isn't just trying to save Peter in terms of like what happens after he dies? What if Jesus is actually trying to save Peter from his old ways of seeing reality? What if Jesus is saving Peter from all the ways that he had an enclosed, smaller point of view? So maybe you were given a version of Jesus that says, this group is right, this group is wrong. Or you've been given a version of Jesus that says, everyone like you is good, everyone not like you isn't. And I would argue that one of the things that Peter has had to confront is maybe it's time to kind of unravel those assumptions. Also, maybe you've been given a version of Jesus that claims doubt is your enemy. Are you with me? Like maybe you've been told in sermons or whatever that doubt is a reflection of some sort of like something that's wrong inside you, that you need to repent for doubting, that you need to feel bad for having questions or for challenging the assumptions that you were handed growing up. And I think one of the things that the life of Peter shows us is like, no, the doubt and the questions and the wrestling, that's all built in. Like that's all built into the system. It's part of, like without doubt, Peter never could have given the speech that he gives in Acts chapter 15. Without working something out and challenging original assumptions, Peter never would have gotten to where he got in Acts 15. So I would argue that the struggle is what makes you grow. It's what makes you better. It's what makes you more of who you were always meant to be. At the previous church where I worked before we moved up here, I would receive emails every once in a while from people who wanted me, who basically their complaint was like, you talk about the doubt stuff like way too much. You need to dial it back. And we actually had people leave the church because I would continually talk about this. And one of the things that they would say is like, you talk about doubt like it's something that can help you grow, but aren't we supposed to have a childlike faith? Like that's what that was always the argument. We're supposed to have a childlike faith where we just accept things, and which to them means ask no questions and take everything at face value, because we all know that small children never ask questions and take everything at face value. Everyone who just laughed has a child, right? Because if you've ever met a child, you know that the last thing they do is like have you tell them something and say like, okay, I guess that's the way it is, right? Like, no. Every bedtime is a press conference. Like you're just trying to get out the door, and you have to, like, as you're backing out, be like, no, I don't know where roly-polies go at night. So can we just pick this up in the morning? So no, nothing is taken for granted. Nothing is taken at face value. There are questions inside questions inside questions. Childlike faith does not mean like, well, okay, you say it, and I guess I believe it. I've never met a child who takes that posture to reality, and certainly none of mine. And so, like, this notion of childlike faith, meaning asking no questions, like, where did you come? Have you met a child? Like, that is not in any way built into the system. So again, if Peter had never asked any questions, he never could have given the speech that he gives in Acts 15. So again, the first thing is a lot of what we see with Peter inside of his character arc is wrestling and questions and doubt and working something out where he's challenging original assumptions. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is whenever God does challenge Peter, it always ends up being towards inclusion and progress. Peter never moves backwards. It is never in terms of maybe we need to close our circles a little bit. Maybe we need to be less inclusive than before. No, it never goes in that direction. It always goes towards more inclusivity, more progress. And so every time Peter identifies a barrier between himself and other people, Jesus seems to cause him to push through that barrier, almost every time. And so Peter has a richer understanding of how grace works as a result of becoming more open, more curious, more inclusive, more grace-oriented towards people who aren't like him. So looking at the life of Peter, what do we learn about what it means to be a follower of Jesus? I would argue it means to constantly challenge our own assumptions, and then to seek to discover what it means to embody love and grace in ways that push past those original assumptions. Let's look at our, to be a disciple of Jesus is not just about reading your Bible or showing up to a specific building on Sundays or giving the correct amount or whatever. It's about growth. It's about becoming more and more of who we were always meant to be. There is no growth if we don't challenge ourselves and ask new questions and look at these original assumptions and just at the very least kind of poke at them a little bit and say, like, are we sure that this is the best way to orient ourselves? Is this the best, healthiest, most Jesus-oriented posture that we can take? And if not, how do we need to adjust? So in 1 Corinthians 13, again, you have this writer Paul in verse 11 saying, when I was a child, again, referring to the childlike nature of whatever, says, when I was a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror, then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three remain. So basically he's saying, like, as I've gotten older and as I've kind of like moved through this journey, I've learned certain things. I've changed, I've evolved. And he says, and at the end of it all, here's what I found. In verse 13, he says, these three remain. In the midst of all of that, the three things that I continue to hold on to: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. So Paul is saying, like, yeah, there's been a lot of challenged assumptions. There's been a lot of movement. There's been a lot of kind of changing my posture towards things. And the things that I continue to hold on to in the midst of all of that, the pillars that continue to stand are faith and hope and love. And the greatest of these is love. He says, when you were younger, you were handed a very simplistic black and white view of how the world works. But now, as you get older, you've had lots of new thoughts and disruptions to why you think those thoughts. And the things that always seem to press on somehow are faith and hope and love. But the greatest of these has always been love. So as it turns out, the longer people spend in this Jesus movement and truly honestly reckoning with what we think and what we believe, and the more we learn and the more we grow, the bigger the world seems to get. The more oriented towards grace and love we become, and not less, the less enclosed we get. So may you find that your character arc resembles Peter's. May you find that you are continually moving towards curiosity and openness. May you find that there is more space as far as you're concerned, there is more space for people who don't fit the description of what you were always told is good, bad, and out. May we become more curious and more open and more grace-oriented toward those around us. And if you grew up in a space, or if you have come out of a space where you were taught that you were not welcome, where you were not invited because you were missing something, because you did not fit the description that somebody else had decided was right versus wrong. First of all, if you're here after that, thank you so much for being here. It takes a tremendous amount of courage and hope to walk into a church after you've been treated like that at another church. I realize that is not an easy thing to do. So first of all, thank you for being here at all. Second of all, I'm so sorry that happened to you. And I'm so sorry that left a mark on you that you've had to carry. And so may you hear what Peter has to say. May you see that no, that was a reflection of an enclosed point of view that we are encouraged to move beyond. May you find that you are more welcome than you ever even knew. And for those of us who grew up with these assumptions, with this enclosed point of view, with this idea that questions and doubt are bad for us, may we heal from that. May we be set free from all the different ways that we were told not to challenge ourselves and not to grow and not to open ourselves up in new kinds of ways. May we become more grace-oriented than ever before. May we find that as we continue to move forward and to challenge and ask questions, that the things that continue are faith and hope and love, and that the greatest of these is love.